One may stand perplexed before some thought, especially seeing men sin, asking oneself, shall I take it by force or by humble love? Always resolve to take it by humble love. If you so resolve, once and for all, you will be able to overcome the whole world. A loving humility is a terrible power, the most powerful of all. Nothing compares with it. All right, I was gonna start this episode by reading an excerpt from some stupid article, and I think it was like The Economist or something. And it said something like, the headline was, "Yes, Russian literature is tainted with imperialism," right? And it's one of those ones that you knew this article was going to come out at some point because there's all this argument going on about whether we should, quote unquote, cancel Dostoevsky, cut him off of our reading lists and not teach him in universities because of, Putin's terrible aggression against Ukraine, right? And this, I, as you know, agree that Putin's aggression against Ukraine is terrible. But like I think most sensible people of various political persuasions, I find this argument completely absurd. Not only because, Dostoevsky lived more than 100 years before the Putin invasion, but also, of course, because of the whole concept that you might need to, scrub certain great works out of the canon because they have, ideas that you don't maybe like the implications of, or indeed, perhaps, maybe there are some bad ideas in them, right? Like we did talk at one point, for instance, about my disagreements with Aristotle about the nature of the human soul, right? But I was insisting at that point, and I insist now, that it would be completely self-defeating, an enormous self-own to develop or to cultivate in oneself that allergy to bad ideas. Like, ooh, don't want to be contaminated, don't want to get near it, right? This is preposterous and self-defeating in so many ways, and it's especially preposterous, of course, when we're up against one of the great novelists, if not the great novelist of the 19th century, maybe the great thinker of the 19th century, certainly a prophet, as he's often been called. And we've been seeing already, I think, the richness of his work. So instead of reading to you from that ridiculous article or spending too much time on it, I just decided, instead, I just want to luxuriate with you in the words of the elder Father Zosima. And that's who I read from at the beginning of this episode. A lot of this episode and the next episode are going to be about him. I have, I think, 2 more episodes on Brothers Karamazov to offer to you. And where we left off last time was on the story of the Grand Inquisitor. You might remember this if you were with us last week. We had the grand kind of half-remembered poem that Ivan, the middle brother, the brilliant one, the one who kind of prefigures Nietzsche in all these ways, had offered to Alyosha as a challenge. He lays this story down effectively as a gauntlet in a moment when Alyosha is not at his most resolved. He's sort of wavering, and we're going to take him this episode through even deeper crises of faith and confidence, right? And so in some ways, Ivan is prodding at him, both because he wants to make him stumble and because he wants him to answer his questions. Ivan is terribly tormented by his own intellect, right? By his ability to think his way out of any question or into any problem, right? And ultimately, although he intuits or knows that there can be some way in which all the unresolvable sorrows of this life would be answered in eternity, right? He actually can't grasp them because he sort of clings to these objections that he expresses in Grand Inquisitor about the inability of humanity to grasp the freedom of Christ, about the kind of Euclidean lines that parallel lines that never meet but meet at eternity. I mean, he has all these things where he says, well, maybe in eternity, suffering is okay, but in the here and now it's not, and I don't accept this world that God has given where we have to wait until the afterlife to receive the kind of blessedness, right? So Alyosha, or Ivan, has laid down this problem before Alyosha, Alexei, his younger brother. And what I said last time was that what we would do next is kind of try to examine and get into the novel's answer to this problem. And it's not a one-to-one answer. So sometimes when you get into talking about things like the problem of pain, the problem of suffering, right, you get tangled up in these syllogisms, right? Well, if God created matter, then matter must have consequences. It's very, it's easy on both sides of this conversation to develop extremely elaborate metaphysical and philosophical kind of if-then arguments. But one of the things that Father Zosima says, Father Zosima being the kind of elder, wise tutor that takes Alyosha under his wing, right? One of the things he says is, in these cases, there is no proof, but it is possible to be convinced. And that's something I want to kind of get into because I think it's really crucial for our own way of understanding the question of faith. Can we believe, right? Which is what Ivan is struggling with, what a lot of us are struggling with. I have all these intellectual objections. I can see a way to answer the intellectual objections, but I still can't plunk for it for some reason. And I think one thing Dostoevsky is saying to us in its novel, it's because you need to taste and see, right? It's not enough to argue your way into or out of any number of different philosophical positions. You actually need to put your hands into the world and get your hands dirty with the world and see which way of looking at the world conduces to greater sanity. This is something that I argue also in my book, How to Save the West, which you can pre-order on Amazon, and I'm going to keep telling you to because I really believe in it and I think you will like it. If you like this show, if you like the work that I do elsewhere, you will love this book. But let's get into the notion of Father Zosima and start to explore how his life and his death help Alyosha to sort of become an answer, to live an answer, rather than to argue for an answer to what Ivan has to say. Let me tell you about the everything store, Public Goods. I really like this moniker for them because it really is the place that you can get everything that you would need in your just basic running of your daily life, your household, the one-stop shop for sustainable, high-quality, everyday essentials. I really like what they make because for two reasons. One, because when you go to the grocery store, it's just like there's so many different brands and a lot of them are made with all this weird gunk and you don't really know what it is. And also it kind of looks gross and weird. And so Public Goods fixes both of those problems. They have this very clean packaging and neat aesthetic. Soaps, for instance, that you can put on your sink without feeling like you're going to get blue gunk everywhere. And that's just, you know that it's going to be good for you, whether it's food or soap or, pet food even. Well, probably not good for you to eat the pet food, but good for your pet and therefore good for you. Happy pet, happy life, as they say. And their freeze-dried duck nibs, which is one of the pet snacks they make, are absolutely bomb. Chad Cat, my cat, loves them. There's this great deal just for my listeners. You can get $15 off your first Public Goods order with no minimum purchase. That's publicgoods.com/heretics, publicgoods.com/heretics, and you will get $15 off, no minimum purchase, just free stuff at publicgoods.com/heretics. So you'll recall that at the end of Grand Inquisitor, Christ, who has been sitting silently, receiving this kind of barrage of accusations from the Grand Inquisitor, who's saying, well, you stood up to all these temptations of the devil. You didn't want to enslave people to bread or to miracles or to any kind of grand fireworks show or to political power. You just wanted them to love you out of their freedom, right? But people aren't up to that. And so we've built this enormous architecture, which is kind of the architecture both of the Catholic Church and of socialism. And he sees in them, Dostoevsky sees in them kind of the same impulse to kind of crack down and make utopia happen rather than draw people out of it, in their freedom. And the answer of Christ to this is simply to stand up and kiss the old man on the lips. And the old man lets Christ go, but he holds to his former idea. And then, I think I mentioned this last week too, Alyosha himself, as he leaves Ivan, stands up and kisses Ivan on the lips as a way of sort of embodying the fact that this is the only, that the answer to this problem is not going to come by talking Ivan out of his many different arguments. Not because there aren't good intellectual responses to this question, but because the question is, if Ivan received those intellectual responses, would he change? Would he feel better? Would he resolve these problems? No, there is a kind of more experiential kind of knowledge that needs to come in here. So now we turn to this guy who kind of gives us the model, the archetype of that experiential knowledge of how do you find joy and sorrow, right? And that is the elder Zosima. He is what's called a starec, and the plural here is starci. This is obviously a Russian word, and it takes the Greek word geron, which means elder, right, and just translates it into Slavic, right, into Slavic languages. And so a starec in Eastern Orthodoxy is one of the things, at least, that he exists to do is to bear witness to the humility and self abandonment and giving of Christ in the midst of the church bureaucracy, right? This is a period, and Dostoevsky depicts this very clearly. This is a period when the church sort of is starting to stand in for like empty hierarchy. And a lot of people are trying to accuse the church of just being a bunch of different self-interested and kind of pharisaical people organizing according to the ways of the world, right? Enriching themselves and so forth. And in Father Zosima, you have this kind of witness to this other form of Christianity. It's not to say that, all institutional forms of Christianity are bad in this novel. It's just that the person of Father Zosima, of this elder, is really what expresses Christ in the world, in the novel, and for Alyosha, who is deeply devoted to this man. You will recall from our previous episodes that Alyosha's father, Fyodor, who you will notice has the same first name as Fyodor Dostoevsky, right? Alyosha's father is totally falling down on the job. He's kind of forgotten about his children when they were very young. They all have been scattered to various different sort of surrogate people to raise them. And Alyosha only has this very early childhood memory of his own mother, who was this kind of highly emotionalized, but also saintly figure. He remembers her weeping before the icon, right, of I think it's Mary. And so this, childless, it's fatherless man, really. I mean, it's not that he has no father. It's that, when your father falls down on the job, what do? This is very normal, right? You seek out a father figure. You look for somebody that can embody all the good forms of authority and instruction and wisdom that you didn't get from the guy that actually gave birth to you, right? And so Zosima, in some ways, has really become that for Alyosha. And because of that, and because of Alyosha's, we read in the novel that he's sort of an early lover of mankind, right? He has this just natural inclination, even when people suck, right? Even when they are doing all the venal, self-interested, petty, small things that they do, he has compassion upon them, right? And because of this bond forms between Zosima and Alyosha. And we even early on, we may get into this. I may read you this passage later on. We get Alyosha hiding behind Zosima's coattails almost, so like almost like a little boy. And part of Alyosha's challenge is he's found this refuge, this oasis of purity in the monastery with Zosima as a novice. And yet Zosima says to him, "You must go out into the world because the purity that he has developed is too fragile, right? It's too restrained. It's too kind of removed from reality." And the epigraph to this novel is from the Gospel of John: "Unless a grain of wheat falls on the ground and dies, it remains but a single grain with no life. But if it falls, right, it bears much fruit." And so Alyosha's journey, he's the hero of the story. His challenge is, how does he take what he has found with Zosima and offer it to the world without letting the world get its dirty fingers all over him, like Ivan kind of wants to do, right? Everybody that Alyosha meets kind of wants to both have what he has, but also to destroy what he has. There's a weird kind of tension or double thought involved in that. And so here's Zosima, right? He's become this central figure for Alyosha, and he's dying. And that is really kind of the pivotal point of the novel. In some ways, this novel is two novels. The first one is about 400 pages. The second one's about 400 pages. And the first novel is about kind of this change in Alyosha, this transformation in Alyosha that allows him to go out into the world. And the second one is what happens when he goes out into the world. And I said before, I don't like to give too many spoilers when I talk about novels, but I think I've figured out a way to not do spoilers while telling you about what is so great about this text. So we know that Zosima is dying, and this is, again, something that I will tell you. He does die in the middle of the book, right? And we get this thing, which I started this series by pointing out that some guy on Twitter said, this was where I threw the book across the room, because it feels like this total digression, right? We get long pages of record of Zosima's life before he entered the priesthood, before he became an elder, and then his sermons, right, and his the words that he gave to people as a mode of kind of as his legacy, essentially, right? We get a ton of Zosima's wisdom distilled here, and in some ways it kind of lays out the vision of the world that is the alternative to Ivan's vision of the world. So I wanted to just read to you a few passages of these words, because they're very profound, and they still really hit, as the kids say, right? They still really land in a way that is useful for us. I read last time from Father Paisi, the other another person in the church who's sort of more circumspect, less kind of giving and abundant than Zosima, but who says, we have the people out there, they think they've resolved the question of the soul with their science, but actually they bear witness to it still in the agony that they have when they're alienated from their spiritual life, right? And so this is developed in further detail by what Zosima has to say. Before I get into reading it, let me just mention here, give a little plug. I mentioned that I was going off to a conference about Brothers Karamazov. I did go to that conference now, and it was just so illuminating and rich and really beautiful. I'm not able, these are conferences that don't, that kind of take place within a circle of trust. So you just agree that you're not going to say anything that, was discussed or to quote people from this conference. And so a lot of these things that I've been thinking, I just will acknowledge, come out of this conference. And I will send you to libertyfund.org, which is the organization that, but first of all, they run Law and Liberty, which is a place I write a lot, and they're I think, publish some really great stuff. And then they also they have a bunch of other projects, including the online library of Liberty, where I often use their texts online. They put out physical books as well if they're in the public domain. So just a note about them, they really did help me in the creation of these episodes, especially. And with that said, let us read some of what Father Zosima has to say. If you are running a business and you're hiring, you need Indeed. People who run businesses, by the way, God bless you. Love small business owners, especially among my audience. I hear from you a lot, and I know that you are good at what you do because you're really in the weeds of your business, right? You're passionate about your product or your service or whatever you're offering to people. You love to get into the nitty-gritty of how to maximize both your profits for your team, but also the quality and the value that you offer to people. And that means you don't necessarily want to be distracted by rifling through a million different resumes, most of which don't fit the job that you're advertising for. It's super important to get good people, not super important for you to waste a ton of time on this crazy job market. That's where Indeed comes in. If you are hiring, they are the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites hoping to find candidates with the right skills, this is the one powerful hiring partner that can help you do it all. You can start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/heretics. That's Indeed.com/heretics to claim your $75 credit. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. So when we move on now into the sermons, the talks and homilies of Father Zosima, we're going to find a lot of this kind of crystallized now. And here's a passage that we'll start with, and then I'll kind of comment on some of what this is offering as an answer to Ivan for Alyosha. Right? The world says, you have needs, therefore satisfy them, for you have the same rights as the noblest and richest men. Do not be afraid to satisfy them, but even increase them. This is the current teaching of the world. That's very prescient about kind of the intense, you might even call it the hyper-capitalism that, you guys know I'm sort of on the conservative side, and so I believe that capitalism itself is a good system, right? But that when you take the brakes away from it, when you deracinate it, remove it from a moral context of, within a moral people, it becomes this kind of rapacious force. And that's, the rapacious force says to you, don't just satisfy your needs, have more needs so you can satisfy them, right? Which is sort of the anti-Traherne in some ways, right? Traherne says your insatiability is good because it points you toward the one thing that can satisfy. Otherwise, everything else will just lead you down more and more. It's kind of this more and more rapacious path, right? What comes of this right to increase one's needs? For the rich, isolation and spiritual suicide. For the poor, envy and murder. For they have been given rights, but have not yet been shown any way of satisfying their needs. We are assured that the world is becoming more and more united, is being formed into brotherly communion by the shortening of distances, by the transmitting of thoughts through the air. Does this sound familiar to you at all? Alas, do not believe in such a union of people. Taking freedom to mean the increase in prompt satisfaction of needs, they distort their own nature, for they generate many meaningless and foolish desires, habits, and the most absurd fantasies in themselves. They live only for mutual envy, for pleasure-seeking and self-conceit. To have dinners, horses, carriages, rank, and slaves to serve them is now considered such a necessity that for the sake of it, to satisfy it, they will sacrifice life, honor, the love of mankind, and will even kill themselves if they are unable to satisfy. A really chilling indictment, right, of the spirit, which I would call in this novel the spirit of Babel. I read to you, I think in the first episode we did on this novel, I read to you for the narrator's claim that the spirit of atheism just is the spirit of socialism, and both just are the effort to do the power of Tower of Babel for real, right? Rather than to draw man up to God, to yank heaven down to earth, right? And to do it by building this elaborate structure. And this is why That Hideous Strength, the C.S. Lewis novel, is called That Hideous Strength, right? It's a reference to a poem about the Tower of Babel. The consummation of that novel involves a curse upon the technologists that they might be, speak gibberish, right? So it's obviously this has been on a lot of people's minds, and the reason for it is that by totally flattening out, right, all people, and into this, not just equality in the sense of equality before the law, but sameness, right? What you create is a total isolation of the individual, right? Not that individualism itself is bad, but that atomization, right? The complete separation of all from all, the total 360-degree freedom to do anything without reference to anything else, right? Which is kind of the logic of capitalism or of unfettered capitalism, right? Unfettered acquisition without moral constraints, right? That logic. Which is also the logic of socialism. Don't get confused, right? Because I say capitalism here as a kind of stand-in for just unfettered rapacity without any other kind of moral reference point. Yeah. When that logic is divorced from the moral society in which it arose, right, it becomes a sort of, just total disassociation of all from all, a Hobbesian war of all against all, right? And that's what Zosima is seeing. And he's saying you're going to just get more things so that you can want more things. And the more you want them, the more you're going to be at odds with your brother, who's going to be wanting in every different possible direction. And this tower, this grand utopia that you're building is going to turn out to be a Tower of Babel that collapses into mutual unintelligibility. And so his solution to this, right, is a different kind of union, a different kind of wholeness, not the wholeness of sameness, but the wholeness of relationship, right? The wholeness in which we are all related to one another by ties both of mutual fallenness and of mutual obligation, right, to Christ and to your fellow man. And this is the kind of this is why cosmic salvation sort of views the world from this, 180-degree angle that answers Ivan's kind of hellish, Ivan's hellscape, right, where everything is just, matter and breaking apart, and there's, meaningless suffering. The renewal of the mind that Zosima is offering us, right, is to say, actually, although all of those things are true, right, we can also understand one another in relationships of mutual obligation, right? It doesn't mean that capitalism is not the best system, right, for doing economics. It just means that it's not the best system for understanding your philosophical being, right, as before God, right? That it needs to take place within this context of understanding yourself as more than simply a desiring agent that just points at things and moves toward them, right? You are also a wholly constituted soul in relationship with other souls, right? And each of you is entire, and yet together you are the entirety of what you are. This is I'm getting a little mystical here. If you want to read the Romans translations that I've been doing on locals, I started talking about this a little bit. But I think of it kind of in terms of relationship of entanglement, quantum entanglement. If you're familiar with this, I'm going to sketch it out in the most basic possible terms. This is a relationship that particles are capable of entering into, in which you might put it this way, that information about particle X is localized or contained within particle Y, right? And that as a system, right, they have the full amount of information about both of them is there. And yet we are used to thinking about information about any individual being localized totally in the individual, right? So we say, where is Bob? Bob is over there, right? We look at Bob. And if let's say that, Bob and Susie are now particles, right? And they're in a relation of quantum entanglement. When we're asking where is Bob, we might need to look at Susie, right? And this is a very bizarre and profound fact about the kind of subatomic levels of reality that people are currently looking at. And yet it expresses nicely, as a metaphor at least, right? Without getting too deeply into the weeds of the physics, right? It expresses expresses nicely the kind of relationship that I'm trying to describe here. It's not that Bob and Susie aren't individuals. And in fact, the information about Bob is definitely about Bob. Like, Bob is in this place and not Susie. And yet Susie is the one who makes that kind of fact real for us in some ways. And this sounds kind of loopy until you start to think about what we actually are as beings, right? That when you are thinking about who you are, there is a form of kind of atomization that teaches you to think of yourself as just this, kind of totally independent, self-reliant entity, right? That all things about you are pre-contained in you. And if you were alone in a room, you would just be able to get down, with enough kind of introspection to the authentic self, right? To the you that has nobody is like watching you. Nobody is trying to influence your decisions, and you don't need to put on a show for anybody. And of course, there is a part of us that is known that way, right? That is intimate and private and personal. And yet one of the things that the myth of Gyges sort of insinuates to us, right, is that or even the Lord of the Rings, right, is that if you were totally isolated from others, right, you would uncover something about yourself, but you might not like it very much, right? It might be the aspect of yourself that is perhaps least human or least fully realized as human. And that's because your human nature, as opposed to your material nature or your brute nature, your animal nature, right? Your human nature is relational, right? Involves love relationships. What are you? In part, you are a loving thing. Maybe that's the highest thing that you are. And so when you enter into society and when you have to be nice to people and even do things you don't necessarily want to do because, you owe it to people, you have ethical obligations, then you find out other things about yourself, like that you do those things. You feel that ethical obligation, right? And that is also part of you. And so some part of you, even if it's not the whole of you, right, is understood best with reference to other people, with reference to the relationships that you're in, your family, right, your community, even your nation, right, your political allegiances. These things are forms of love relationship at their highest, and they are part of what makes you who you are, to put it as bluntly as possible. Yeah, and so these two visions of the world, right, that are being opposed to one another are the one in which is kind of in some sense the Freudian psychoanalytic vision, right, the one in which the real you, right, is deeper and deeper inside yourself. Just dig deeper and deeper, scratch off all the dirt of society, societal norms, expectations, gender roles, right? All these things that you now hear so maligned, right? Scratch them away. And somewhere in there's a core of your being that is, you, that is what you are at essence, at base. But the thing about it, as I've said, is that you, right, is like the you and me baby ain't nothing but mammals. Let's just do it like they do on the Discovery Channel, right? It's what Plato depicts as kind of a tangled mass of snakes just like writhing against one another, because it's just a kind of inchoate raw material of a person, right? And that's why I think, nothing against therapy. I think talking to a person in a relational way can be very helpful. But the sort of psychoanalytic turn inward, right, has produced yet more and more introspection, right, and less kind of sanity, which involves the more refined sociological, civilizational part of you, right, the part of you that turns outward, that looks at others, that relates to others, that is in this kind of entanglement relationship where who you are is completed by who I am, and who I am is completed by who you are, right? And that is the body of Christ, right? That is the form of kind of intimate relationship, which doesn't dissolve you into either an atomized being or just a formless collective, but resolves you into a relationship with a whole group of people, and indeed with all humanity, right? Cosmic man, so that you can become more fully yourself in your integration into a whole that is made up of distinct parts. This is the Trinity also, of course, right, is like, and it's also how we see things working in the world. It's the tripartite soul, right? It's any good sports team has individuals who have different skills and talents, and yet they kind of bounce off of one another and amplify each other, right? This happens at every level of nature and of psychology. So this is kind of the crux, I think, of what Dostoevsky is offering us as an alternative to the incomprehensible suffering that Ivan is struggling against. It's not that suffering doesn't exist, right? It's that it implicates you and me together, right, in a relationship of mutual obligation that is only answered by an experience of what Zosima calls active love, right? So we're going to get into that in a little bit. But let me first read to you another passage that kind of develops some of this and maybe can suggest some reasons why the institution of the starets, of the elder, or indeed the person of Father Zosima himself, is not particularly comfortable, doesn't sit particularly comfortable within a church bureaucracy or a church hierarchy. So this is a discourse of hell and fire. Fathers and teachers, I ask myself, what is hell? And I answer thus, the suffering of being no longer able to love. Once in infinite existence, measured neither by time nor by space, a certain spiritual being, through his appearance on earth, was granted the ability to say to himself, I am and I love. Once only, he was given a moment of active, living love. So I guess we will get into this right now, in fact, of active, living love. And for that, he was given earthly life with its times and seasons. And what then? This fortunate being rejected the invaluable gift, did not value it, did not love it, looked upon it with scorn, and was left unmoved by it. This is his reading of the book of Genesis and of Adam, right? Once in infinite existence, measured neither by time nor space, a certain spiritual being, through his appearance on earth, was granted this ability. And actually, it's not totally clear to me whether he's talking about Adam or Satan, but Satan will come up later in the novel, so we'll talk a little bit about him later. And what then? This fortunate being rejected the invaluable gift, did not value it, did not love it, looked upon it with scorn, and was left unmoved by it. This being, having departed the earth, sees Abraham's bosom and talks with Abraham, and is shown us in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, as he beholds paradise and could rise up to the Lord. But his torment is precisely to rise up to the Lord without having loved, to touch those who loved him who disdained their love. For he sees clearly and says to himself, now I have knowledge, and though I thirst to love, there will be no great deed in my love, no sacrifice, for my earthly life is over, and Abraham will not come with a drop of living water, that is, with a renewed gift of the former life, earthly and active, to cool the flame of the thirst for spiritual love that is burning in me now, since I scorned it on earth. Life is over, and time will be no more. There is, later on in the novel, a sort of rumor going around, or an accusation going around, which is really, which the narrator says is painfully mistaken, that he was denying, Zosima was denying in this the doctrine of hell and eternal damnation, or physical damnation, right? And it's not that at all. It's that he's saying there is in the scriptural stories, the parables about the afterlife, a picture of a state of being that is so deprived that it is tantamount to and worse than, right, eternal torment. And it is the inability, right? If you've ever seen Alistair Sim's Christmas Carol, the movie, in which Scrooge is visited by three spirits, and they warn him about the way that he's kind of cutting himself off from his fellow man, right? And this is very Dickensian, right? There's a wonderful scene in which the ghost of Jacob Marley takes Scrooge up to the window and shows him all of these damned souls that are tossing ghostly money at a beggar in the street, right? And the idea is they seek to intervene in human matters but have lost their power to do so, I think is what Marley says. And that is the hell that Zosima is talking about here, and it's the opposite, right, of the experience of active love, right? The option is available to you right now, right, to do a thing for no other reason than that you love, right, and that you are trying to do good in the world. And yes, I know the sort of Joey objection from friends, right, which is that there is no such thing as real altruism because we always have an ulterior motive, right? It's true that there is always in this life some other thing desired going on in the back of your head. There's always, every part of us is kind of, all of our righteousness is a filthy rags. I acknowledge this. And yet we know, right, we know that there is such a thing, right, as doing an act of charity for the sake of it and loving that act of charity, right? It's kind of a virtue ethics type thing, that it's not enough to do the good, although that's a good start, right? It's delighting to do the good that is the experience of heaven, the experience of active love, right, which binds us to one another, binds us to one another in need, right, makes us understand that the need of another is also our need, it is also Christ's need, right? That's what Zosima is sort of offering us. And the diagnostic test of it is not, well, which one can make a better, syllogistic argument, which one can explicate it better the way I am sort of trying to explicate Zosima's point of view now, but rather, how is each one working out for you, right? And the next thing Dostoevsky is basically going to do is he's going to dramatize the how's it working out for you question. We have the kind of death of this, profoundly generous and kind man, has transformed the lives of so many. And then we're going to get, and we'll probably talk more about this next week, we're going to get the descent of Ivan into madness. And so Zosima's argument here is, or rather Dostoevsky's argument, I think here is that, yes, you can kind of make arguments for seeing the world in two different ways. One, a kind of atomized wasteland of all against all. The other, a uniquely and irrevocably entangled relationship of all men together as individuals in the sight of God, right? Now, there's no proof to be offered that one of those is going to win out over the other, right? And yet one of them comports with what we long for when we long for joy, right? And the other one does not. And so that's going to be kind of the next part of this here. Let me read to you one more passage from Zosima before we move on from him and talk about the aftermath of his death. And the reason I wanted to read to you this passage here is it's in some ways, if you're looking for an answer to Ivan that is kind of more direct, right? Remember, Ivan's whole thing was about the needless suffering of children, right? It's incredibly wrenching and painful, and Dostoevsky places it very explicitly before our eyes as a powerful argument, right, against believing in the goodness of God. And Zosima, I think, kind of points a way toward an answer here in his raptures about Holy Scripture. He says, what a book is the Holy Scripture! What miracle, what power are given to man with it, like a carven image of the world and of man and of human characters, and everything is named and set forth unto ages of ages, and so many mysteries resolved and revealed. God restores Job again. Remember, we read the book of Job together, or parts of it, and talked about the restoration of him at the end as kind of something that must be more spiritual than the material replacement of his children. It gives him wealth anew. Once more, many years pass, and he has new children, different ones, and he loves them. Oh Lord, one thinks, but how could he so love these new ones when his former children are no more, when he has lost them? Remembering them, was it possible for him to be fully happy as he had been before with the new ones, however dear they might be to him? But it is possible. It is possible. The old grief, by a great mystery of human life, gradually passes into quiet, tender joy. Instead of young, ebullient blood comes a mild, serene old age. I bless the sun's rising each day, and my heart sings to it as before. But now I love it setting even more. Its long, slanting rays, and with them quiet, mild, tender memories, dear images from the whole of a long and blessed life. And over all is God's truth, moving, reconciling, all forgiving. You will recall, perhaps, the figure of Cephalus from the Republic, Book 1, the kind of elder statesman who enters into the conversation with the young guys for a while and then says, I'm going to bed, right? And he says, he has this idea that actually, Zosima has, I think, a kind of a richer sense, right? That the intensity of sorrow that Ivan is engaging with, it's real, right? But that with time, actually, if you let yourself accept that you have, entered into this world, if you take the ticket, Ivan says, I'm returning my ticket to God's world. If you take the ticket to God's world, with time and with prayer, right, you will realize that even those sorrows kind of mellow out under God's forgiveness and love, right? Part of this, of course, requires you to acknowledge the guilt of all before all, right? That the child's suffering is in some sense your suffering, and that the child's suffering is also in some sense your fault, right? You are guilty for everything before everybody in a spiritual sense. Doesn't mean that, again, just as this doesn't mean we should dissolve capitalism, it doesn't mean we should dissolve the legal system either. It just means that there is a higher reality than both of those things that we need in order to understand them, right? That we enter into the guilt of all before all in order to know that, really the one that suffers in all, most of all, is Christ, and that's the point of the cross, right? This is the vision that Zosima is offering as an alternative to the vision Ivan is offering. Let's talk about what happens now when he dies. It is so easy to get bundled up into subscription scams, but rocket money can help. You got to check these guys out. You might remember them as Truebill when they started sponsoring Young Heretics. That's what they were called. But they have now grown from a bill management app into a full-on personal finance empowerment tool that helps over 3.4 million people with budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions, and more. So as they get bigger and as they get better, the artist formerly known as Truebill is now called Rocket Money. They save each of their members on average $700 a year. They're everything that you and I loved about Truebill with a fresh look and feel. You can start canceling your unused subscriptions and save money at rocketmoney.com/heretics. It's super important to get down and dirty with your finances. I know that this is something people don't love to do. I don't love to do it, but Rocket Money has helped me a lot and it can help you too. It's rocketmoney.com/heretics to start saving money today. All sorts of excellent testimonials of people who have canceled, because they get you tangled up in these terrible, they give you a free sample and then you have like a week free, but then suddenly it's like you've paid for a year or something. Rocketmoney.com/heretics to fix all that. Okay, so there is something very interesting and Dostoevsky in what happens after Zosima dies. I say it's Dostoevsky because it's the kind of move that I, at least, could never have come up with. And it's so distinctive and strange and almost kind of tragicomic that you sort of think, what the heck is he up to? And that's because he was a genius novelist, right? And I am just a schmo reading his novels. But he's always one step ahead of you because Zosima dies and you sort of think, well, there's a lot of sentimentalism attached to this guy. He has these very beautiful outpourings of faith and belief, and everybody sort of expects him to be met with a miracle after he dies. And instead, he starts to stink. His body starts to stink really bad. And you'll remember maybe in the Gospels with the resurrection of Lazarus that that's a sign of real death, right? But of course, it's also a sign of corruption, right? And it's a sign of just the ugliness of the world. And what's so horrifying about this to Alyosha is that some saints, right, have had a miracle associated with them, that their body was incorrupted, right, was incorruptible, right? And now Zosima, his great teacher, his mentor, the one he admires so, is not only not producing the miracle of not stinking, he's stinking real bad. And the idea of the stench, right, which is in Russian associated with roots that have to do with smerd, right? And there's a character we'll talk about probably next week, Smerdyakov, the illegitimate son, that has this characteristic too, and is kind of associated with all of the ugly things of the world that are hard to love. And this is just tremendously disappointing to Alyosha and sends him into what you might call a dark night of the soul. And it's in that context, as he's beginning to doubt, right? Was my master not right? Were his rivals in the church more correct, right? We haven't even gotten into some of his more ferocious rivals who then come and start to accuse Zosima of having been a false prophet, right? And this is profoundly troubling for Alyosha, who is generally a kind of, he's a reserved and composed figure almost to a fault in this novel. We'll talk next week about Dostoevsky's concerns that people would find him too passive, right? Because he tends to be very composed. And in this moment, we get him kind of low. And it's in this context that Rakitin comes to him to offer him temptation. Now, Rakitin, we've met before. He's the seminary student, right, who is actually kind of a socialist and going to go on not to become a monk or anything, but to become kind of a literary muckamuck in the sorts of circles that Dostoevsky himself moved in earlier life, right? He's going to go and distinguish himself as a writer, as a thinker of the new age, and even more than Ivan, who is sort of tormented by these sort of Nietzschean visions. Rakitin is going to be just the unblushing disciple, gospel preacher of the new socialist paradise. We will find, at one point he says, we will find in ourselves the reasons for altruism and virtue, right? And that's just the kind of thing I was just talking about, right? Digging further and further into yourself, right? This sort of, it's maybe unfair to Rousseau to call it Rousseauian, but the kind of raw man will be the best man, right? Now, that is the guy who comes up now to Alyosha, and Rakitin is almost like a kind of a minor devil figure. I mean, I would suggest perhaps that he's a satanic being, because he's always offering this temptation. He's kind of venal, and he says, "Why don't you go visit Grushenka?" And this is a character that I think I mentioned maybe, but we haven't really met. Her full name is, and my apologies to Russian friends if I'm mispronouncing this, but her full name is Agrafena Alexandrovna Svetlov. And that is, remember, we talked about her, that means her dad's name, right, is Alexander, right? And her name, Grushenka, is like a diminutive or a shortened, it's a nickname, right? So everybody is on these kind of familiar terms with him because she's known as this kind of loose woman. She has a dark past, never quite revealed exactly what happened, although we get more and more as the book goes on. And she's the object of desire in this really twisted love triangle between Dmitri, the oldest son, and Fyodor, the father, which kind of kicks off the whole book, right? That they're in this love triangle. They both desire her. And she is known as this sort of loose woman. And so the idea is that she will, Alyosha will go to Grushenka, and then they will sleep together, and the fall of Alyosha will be complete. In some ways, this is like the first big temptation of Alyosha. And then for the rest of the book, we're just going to get more and more temptations thrust before Alyosha. But this is a big one, because she comes up to him. She's this kind of, she's like a ripe plum. She's this very rich pear. She has this kind of all these fruit metaphors. Alyosha crucially is a man. He's not like a sort of ascetic. He's described as kind of ruddy, and even though he's retiring from the world, he recognizes the appeals and attraction of women. And now he's in this low point, right? And what happens next is something totally unexpected, and that is that in this kind of weird entanglement relationship, right, this completing of one another's need with each other, right, Alyosha and Grushenka do not sleep together. Instead, they experience a kind of spiritual peace together, and it all hinges on this story, the story of the onion. So that's what I'm going to read to you now, the story of the onion, which Grushenka tells to Alyosha. And they both kind of recover in this, a sense of themselves as children of God. It's an amazing scene. So here it is, right? The story of the onion, which she tells to kind of justify, or not to justify herself, that's not fair, but to express what's going on with her, right? And so Alyosha says, "I came here looking for a wicked soul. I was drawn to that because I was low and wicked myself, but I found a true sister. I found a treasure, a loving soul. She spared me just now. I'm speaking of you, Agrafena Alexandrovna." So here he does not call her by her sort of nickname. He calls her by her full name. "You restored my soul just now." So she turns to Alyosha and she tells this story. "Once upon a time there was a woman, and she was wicked as wicked could be, and she died. And not one good deed was left behind her. The devils took her and threw her into the lake of fire. And her guardian angel stood thinking, what good deed of hers can I remember to tell God? Then he remembered and said to God, once she pulled up an onion and gave it to a beggar woman. And God answered," it's a tiny experience of active love, right? "And God answered, now take that same onion, hold it out to her in the lake, let her take hold of it and pull. And if you pull her out of the lake," this is the lake of fire, right? "She can go to paradise, but if the onion breaks, she can stay where she is." The angel ran to the woman and held out the onion to her. "Here, woman," he said, "take hold of it and I'll pull." And he began pulling carefully and had almost pulled her all the way out when other sinners in the lake saw her being pulled out, and all began holding on to her so as to be pulled out with her. But the woman was wicked as wicked could be, and she began to kick them with her feet. "It's me who's getting pulled out, not you. It's my onion, not yours." No sooner did she say it than the onion broke, and the woman fell back into the lake and is burning there to this day. And the angel wept and went away. That's the fable, Alyosha. I know it by heart because I myself am that wicked woman. I boasted to Rakitin that I gave an onion, but I'll say it differently to you. In my whole life, I've given just one little onion. That's how much good I've done. And don't praise me after that, Alyosha. Don't think I'm good. I'm wicked. Wicked as can be. And if you praise me, you'll make me ashamed. Let me confess everything. Listen, Alyosha, I wanted so much to lure you here and pestered Rakitin so much that I even promised him 25 rubles if he'd bring you to me. And this goes on for a while, right? But the story of the onion, right, which is actually an interesting story to offer as a hopeful parable because it has an unhappy ending, right? But the point of it is that the single act of active love, right, would be enough to redeem the sinner if it could be done in the spirit of active love, right? But because the sinner is kind of wicked in her heart, when the people start to grab onto her ankles, she says, I'm the only one going to heaven. And that's the moment the onion breaks. It's not the onion, right? It's not the size of the good deed. And we're going to get into questions of quantity and quality next week. It's not the size of the good deed. It's the spirit in which it's done and the attitude, like a mustard seed, that can grow even from that tiny act of good. The question really that's unanswered in the story is, what if she hadn't kicked all the sinners off of her ankles from hell, right? What if they had just been carried up with her by the strength of that one onion? I think we're supposed to believe, right, that's what's possible, right? That if she had, the reason she's in hell is because she's incapable of making that assertion, right? That this onion is kind of like all I have to offer for myself. As Grushenka says, right? I've done all the good I've done is as much as this little tiny onion. And if she could acknowledge that, right, and be carried up with it, then the strength of that act of love might bring all of hell up to be redeemed, right? Here's why I think that, because the last scene I'm going to read to you is from what happens as Alyosha keeps vigil over the body of Zosima, right? So he's come back now after all of this. And this is kind of the way that he has his doubts and anxieties resolved after the great stench. Well, this is just a man. He's decomposing just like a man, right? And we're not going to get, it seems like, a kind of supernatural miracle to resolve to tell us once and for all that actually he was divine. And yet, as Alyosha drifts off, falls asleep as after this crazy day, right? He begins to have this dream. What's this? Why are the walls of the room opening out? Ah, yes, this is the marriage, the wedding feast. Yes, of course. Here are the guests. Here are the newlyweds in this festive crowd. And who is the wise ruler of the feast? But who is this? Who, again, the room is opening out. Who is getting up from the big table? What? Is he here too? Why, he is in the coffin. But here too, he has gotten up. He's seen me. He's coming over. Lord, yes, to him came the little wizened old man with fine wrinkles on his face, joyful and quietly laughing. Now there was no coffin anymore, and he was wearing the same clothes as the day before when he sat with them and visitors gathered around him. His face was all uncovered and his eyes were radiant. Can it be that he too is at the banquet, that he too has been called to the marriage in Cana of Galilee? I too, my dear, I too have been called and chosen, the quiet voice spoke over him. Why are you hiding here, out of sight? Come and join us. His voice, the elder Zosima's voice, how could it be anyone else, since he was calling? The elder raised Alyosha a little with his hand, and Alyosha got up from his knees. We are making merry, the wizened man continued. We are drinking new wine, the wine of a new and great joy. See how many guests there are. Here are the bridegroom and the bride. Here is the wise ruler of the feast, tasting the new wine. Why are you marveling at me? I gave a little onion, and so I am here. And there are many here who only gave an onion. Only one little onion. What are our deeds? And you, quiet one, you, my meek boy, today you too were able to give a little onion to a woman who hungered. Begin, my dear, begin, my meek one, to do your work. It's an amazing dream. And what's so beautiful about it is that it does not give you the supernatural miracle that you want, because in this text, supernatural miracles are almost cheating, right? It's like the doubting Thomas, blessed is he who is not seen. That yes, there is supernature, but it always comes to us mediated through nature, right? This is a kind of modernist gesture almost that Dostoevsky makes here, and he makes it throughout the novel, that those who wait for signs and portents will miss them, because the signs and portents are already here in the way that the real world kind of whispers to us about something beyond it. And so instead of getting this kind of spectacular miracle, he gets this dream, and it's the dream of the onion, and so to go out, right, in this question of quantity and quality, which we'll pick up next week, right? You can do as much good as you want, right? And it will still be just a little onion compared to the vastness of God, right? And yet, because of the quality of it is a quality of love, right? Because of the nature of the thing, rather than the amount of it, but the quality of it is love. It is enough, right? It is enough to bring whatever is redeemable in you to the land of the redeemed. I'm going to pause there. There's another beautiful passage where Alyosha himself kind of bows down to the earth, but I'm going to leave you to hopefully go read the novel to get that, and we instead will do the mailbag. I am once again asking you to stop buying stuff from people who hate you. Gold River Trading Company can sell you excellent, high-quality tea without stuffing all sorts of anti-human, bizarre, woke ideas down your kids' throats. If you are out there at all in the political world these days, you will notice that you don't even have to be like a hardline right winger conservative. But if you just, believe that like, boys are boys and girls are girls, and that you shouldn't like teach kids about obscure, arcane sexuality things in school, or to hate one another based on race, like it's really hard to buy from a company that doesn't just like deeply oppose the baseline reality ideas that you have about the world. Gold River Trading Company is on your side in this, and they make excellent tea. They have a 1776 American breakfast blend, which I really love. But then there's a bunch of other good ones like the chamomile, if you don't like caffeine all that much, or they have an excellent gunpowder green tea as well. When you go to goldriverco.com, you can save 15% on all orders using the discount code Heretics, Heretics, for 15% all orders, and you can trust this is a pro-America and anti-woke brand. goldriverco.com. Use the promo code Heretics. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals, youngheretics.com/locals. Here is one from Sox Nation SLC. Spencer Klavan. While listening to Traherne Part 3, especially deep in the episode where you were discussing man's desires and wants, I kept waiting for you to mention Girard and mimetic desire. Specifically, I was thinking that Jesus himself was and is supposed to be the object of mimetic desire, the central focus of all for all. As I recall, you or someone else in the Ring of Honor has said something like that. Is it appropriate to connect Traherne and Girard in this way? As always, thanks. Yes, and I think it's appropriate even, I love this suggestion, I even think it's appropriate to connect Dostoevsky and Traherne and Girard, right? So you have, chronologically, you would start with Dostoevsky, or excuse me, that's wrong. Chronologically, you would start with Traherne, right, and then lead up through Dostoevsky, and then get to Girard. I think they're all together recognizing something. And Girard, very close reader of Dostoevsky, by the way, right? The idea that desire is mimetic, right? That we long and we do not know what we long for. And so we kind of take our desires from other people, and we want things because they are wanted, right? Which creates, of course, rivalries, right? And cycles of rivalries and all the stuff we talked about when we talked about scapegoating back in the Girard episodes. The answer to this, right, is to turn that desire onto something which can reflect back to you a stable ground, right? A thing that is good enough to answer all of this, and that will then call you into a relationship of imitation, right? Rather than desiring, what your brother wants or what everybody online wants, right? Desire what Christ wants, because what Christ wants is God. Christ is able to want God, who is the highest good. He's able to look almost in this kind of Socratic way, right, at the good beyond all goods. And you, looking at him, can want what he wants, right? This is kind of akin to the passage that I went back to when we were doing Traherne, and that was Augustine, right? Our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you, which is then, I think, really echoed in that Traherne desire, right? We have this description that we have these insatiable desires, and we turn them toward all different things, right? So toward everything that we can find. But that just produces more desire in us. The world is not big enough, right? And that's because the kind of thing that we want is not more and more. It's better and better, and finally best, right? The root of all goods. And so we just keep getting more and more to try to satisfy that, but it only gives us more desire. This is what Dostoevsky has Zosima describe, right? In the kind of ruthless acquisitionism, if you might call it, of kind of, capitalism without moral breaks, or socialism itself, right, in its essence, right, this sort of endless sea of quantity rather than the kind of resolution into quality. And that's what kind of Girard gives us, I think, in the relationship with man and Christ, right, that Christ points us upward at a thing that answers all of our desires, and so brings them into peace and allows them to be directed to the lesser things kind of in a derivative way. Yes, great. It's great to add Girard into that mix. I think we've been talking about this subject from a lot of different angles. And I think one reason why Girard is so powerful is because he kind of gives us a framework for thinking about this in the modern day. Okay, that's it for me. I will see you next week. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. It's ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, AmericanMind.org, and Claremont.org. You can also donate to support our work in defense of the American idea at Claremont.org/donate. If you do that, please mention that you heard about us through Young Heretics, and I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.